Okay, thanks so much for your.
It's working now, right?
Yeah, it's all set. Perfect. Thank you all so much. Yeah. And my name is Shay. I coordinate the Divest from the War Machine campaign, and I'm really glad to have you all here with us today. This is the Right to Boycott, Resisting the Crackdown on BDS. During today's webinar, we are going to learn more about the recent wave of anti-BDS legislation, what it means for the movement for Palestinian rights, and its impact on other forms of divestment and social movement organizing broadly. I'm really excited about this call. It's really timely, and I think it'll prompt some really good discussion. While we're doing the call, we're going to be building towards a community Q&A at the end, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them as we can at the end. And I'm going to put some community norms in the chat, but we're all here. We're in community together, so please make sure to be respectful of each other and of our speakers. Thank you so much. Okay. We are joined today by Meera Shah, the Senior Staff Attorney at Palestine Legal. Meera supports the organization's casework and public education and oversees the advocacy work on free speech, academic freedom, and the right to boycott. So I think we are first going to hand it over to Noor to talk a little bit about the background on BDS movement organizing and why this is so important. And then we're going to move over to a presentation about what's happening right now with the recent wave of anti-BDS legislation. So Noor, can I pass it over to you?
Yes, thanks so much, Shay. So if we're going to be talking about anti-BDS legislation, first, we all need to know what BDS is, right? And we need to have like a good foundation there. And to talk a little bit about how it's used in Palestinian liberation. So according to the BDS movement website, boycott, divestment, sanctions is a Palestinian-led movement for freedom, justice, and equality. BDS upholds the simple principle that Palestinians are entitled to the same rights as the rest of humanity. And the BDS movement draws inspiration from the South African anti-apartheid movement. In that same way, the BDS call urges action to pressure Israel to comply with international law. So BDS operates as this tool within the movement for Palestinian liberation that seeks to meet the objective of liberation by calling on the international community to put pressure on Israel. So that's kind of the big thing there. We want the global community to take part in our liberation movement by pressuring Israel, and in that way, they'll respond and restore human rights to Palestinians. So it began in 2005 when over 170 organizations came together, and they demanded that their 3 demands would be met, and until then the BDS movement would persist. And those 3 demands are that Israel ends its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, including Palestine, and dismantling the apartheid wall in Palestine, recognizing the fundamental rights of Palestinian citizens in Israel to full equality, because at this point they are second-class citizens. And finally, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. So according to the UN and international law, Palestinians who were exiled from their homes have the legal right to return back to those homes, yet that's not being fulfilled. Although we Palestinians love to say we don't need international law to tell us that we have a right to our land, we know that ourselves, but just to add that in there, it is illegal in international law. So as I mentioned earlier, BDS stands for boycott, divestment, sanctions. Let me give you more context as to what that means. So boycotts are probably what you've heard the most when it comes to BDS, and they're a method of withdrawing support from Israel's apartheid regime. And this includes refusing to engage with complicit Israeli sporting, cultural, and academic institutions, and all Israeli international companies which violate Palestinian human rights. So it doesn't just target Israeli companies, but also a company that decides to operate in illegal settlements in Palestine. They would be targeted by the BDS movement as well, because they profit off of the occupation. And the divestment Divestment campaigns call on banks, local councils, churches, pension funds, and universities to eliminate funding to the state of Israel and all companies sustaining Israeli apartheid. And finally, sanctions. Sanction campaigns urge governments to take impactful action against Israeli apartheid by banning business with illegal Israeli settlements, ending military trade and free trade agreements, and suspending Israel's membership in international forums like the UN. So most individuals can support BDS through boycotts. Like, as I mentioned, that's where more people show their support. And we'll talk about that more later. Now I'm going to pass it to Shah, though, so we can talk about how this has been impacting other forms of divestment organizing, not necessarily Palestinian organizing.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, and just building on that and bringing us to Meera's presentation today, we're going to be learning a lot more about this recent wave of anti-BDS legislation, but something that is really important to keep in mind today is that legislative attacks on activists, communities, groups' abilities to organize in support of boycott, divestment, and sanctions is ultimately part of a larger move to attack progressive movement work to move money and power out of violent systems. So organizing around environmental social governance, or ESG investment, also known as socially responsible investment, SRI, divesting from fossil fuels, private prisons, firearms, military weapons, and beyond are all being threatened by this attack on BDS, which is by design. Anti-BDS legislation has actually been working really insidiously to lay the groundwork to suppress movements' abilities to boycott companies for political reasons. The power of boycott and divestment and sanctions, which Noor was just talking about, from its incredible strength in the movement against apartheid in South Africa to its power today, is something that conservative politicians and CEOs are picking up on. And they are creating this legislation to prevent that type of organizing by cracking down on BDS and Palestine solidarity organizing primarily. The intertwined nature of anti-BDS and anti-socially responsible investing work is something that is being mapped out really clearly in Texas and other states as well. But in Texas, especially, it's where we have some stuff on the record. Jason Isaac, who currently works for a conservative think tank, but was formerly a Republican member of the state legislature, demonstrated this overlap in 2016 when he co-authored a piece of Texas legislation banning the state from conducting business with individuals or companies that engaged in BDS. And following this legislation, he really just very soon after drafted almost identical legislation preventing the state from conducting businesses with companies that boycott or divest from fossil fuels, which was passed. He openly cited the inspiration that he received from anti-BDS legislation. He said, "We are proud to stand firmly with one of our greatest allies," he's referring to Israel, "and to show the same support to the energy workers who power our state and our entire nation." The CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, which is a famously Zionist organization that weaponizes claims of anti-Semitism against people organizing for Palestine solidarity, has stated that environmental social governance investment is the latest frontier in the fight against anti-Semitism. Conservative legislators, CEOs, and beyond are saying out loud what we need to be centering in our work, which is that these attacks on BDS are not just attacks on that, they're an attack on our entire movement, and we need to be treating them as such and organizing in solidarity. So this is the grounding, the part of the call that's about divestment more broadly, but so that we can learn a bit more about what's physically happening or what's actually happening on the ground and how we can be supporting. I'm going to move it over to Meera to teach us about the anti-BDS legislation.
Thanks, Shay. I'm just going to share my screen here. Give me a second. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Shay and Noor, for that intro, and to CODEPINK for organizing and hosting this webinar. My name is Meera Shah. I'm an attorney with Palestine Legal. I'm going to start just with a quick intro to Pal Legal for those who might not be as familiar. We are a legal advocacy organization whose mission is to bolster the grassroots movement for Palestinian rights here in the U.S. We provide legal advice, know your rights trainings, advocacy, litigation support to college students, grassroots activists, and others who stand for justice in Palestine. We also document and track tactics being used to silence advocates for Palestinian rights, including legislative repression. And we have a website where we keep track of legislative developments. You can find much of this information along with other resources there as well. So as Noor described, there's the BDS movement here in the US. It's growing. There's a growing Palestine solidarity movement here in the US. It's student-led, it's diverse, it's dynamic. We see a range of different actors engaging in different forms of advocacy, including BDS, to stand against Israel's treatment of Palestinians. And the movement is increasingly characterized by cross-movement support. You see Palestine is interconnected with Indigenous, Black, and other racial justice struggles, and it's also increasingly filtering up from the grassroots. So we see athletes, artists, celebrities, and even some politicians who are willing to break from the status quo. And, I think it's important to bring it back here to, the growing movement for Palestinian rights here is in direct response to Israel's ongoing and systematic violations of Palestinian human rights. We, have a decade-plus blockade and the repeated destruction of Gaza, unending settlement growth and settler violence that takes place with impunity, systematic human rights abuses, and a discriminatory legal regime that is committing crimes of apartheid and crimes against humanity, according to major human rights organizations. And this is all taking place with the full backing and financial support of the US. And, in light of yesterday's horrific news from Jenin, which brings the number of Palestinians killed in similar attacks on Palestinian homes and communities to nearly 30 since the start of the year, and in light of one of the most hardline racist Israeli governments taking power, this on-the-ground context is just crucial. And, the legislation and the repression that I'm going to talk about today, it describes an effort to get us to look away from those facts and to stop talking about what's happening in Palestine. And I think that is one reason why it's so important to push back and reject these efforts to chill and to silence, and, equally, if not more important, to ensure that we continue to bring the focus back to Palestinian voices, experiences, and demands. So just to sort of preface with that, I'm going to sort of turn to the repression that we're seeing, and to situate the legislative attacks within a broader context here. So, these calls for freedom, equality, justice, and accountability for Palestinians have been met with efforts to censor and chill and sanction. And what we've seen is that advocates who speak out for Palestinian rights are routinely harassed, surveilled, threatened, falsely accused, censored, punished. Legal has documented this widespread censorship and harassment of Palestine activists over the years, with more than 2,200 incidents that we've documented since 2014. And we've seen similar tactics over and over. It's censor, smear, threaten. We have school administrators pressured to scrutinize, restrict, or censor student events related to Palestine. Smear campaigns that pressure employers to punish or fire employees. Frivolous complaints and lawsuits filed. Faculty investigated for coursework or syllabus material related to Palestine, and hundreds of other incidents. There's the pattern is that anti-Palestinian groups attempt to generate pressure on decision makers to punish or silence anyone who speaks out in support of Palestinian rights, often wielding false anti-Semitism or terrorism smears. And this is the context in which we've seen this repressive legislation targeting advocacy for Palestinian rights sort of coming into play. And what we've seen with the legislation, some of these stats are a little outdated at this point. We're seeing different trends, but we have now more than 260 bills introduced targeting advocacy for Palestinian rights. We have 35 states that currently have some form of this repressive legislation in effect. And while more than 75% of these bills have failed, they keep coming. And there have been more than a dozen introduced since the start of this year alone. We're still in the process of adding them to our site, so they're not all up there yet, but we are tracking them, and there's a lot. So what are these laws? What do they do? Anti-BDS or anti-boycott laws targeting Palestine advocacy generally take the form of prohibiting state contracts with or state investment in entities that boycott Israel. And these laws often require potential state contractors to provide a written certification or loyalty oath that they are not and will not engage in boycotts against Israel. Some states require officials to compile and make publicly available blacklists of entities that support boycotts, prohibiting state contracts or investments with listed entities. And, these laws have had a material impact on the lives and livelihoods of those directly affected by them. Bahia Amawi is a speech pathologist based in Texas who lost her contract to provide needed services for school-aged children after she refused to sign a written certification pledging not to boycott. And, journalist and filmmaker Abby Martin, similarly, who had been invited to speak at a conference in Georgia, that event was canceled after Martin refused to sign a pledge to not boycott Israel as required by Georgia's anti-BDS law. But, beyond these direct applications and consequences, these laws have a chilling effect on speech that goes far beyond their stated parameters or objectives. The confusion over the scope or deliberate misapplication of these laws has resulted in chilling, punishing, or attempting to punish speakers supporting Palestinian rights in a range of different contexts outside that of state funding or contracts. And, it's important to know that that's the goal. These laws are designed to chill you into self-censorship. Federal courts in Arizona, Georgia, Kansas, and Texas have blocked state anti-BDS laws as unconstitutional. They found that boycotts for Palestinian rights are not distinguishable from historical civil rights boycotts that the Supreme Court has said are protected under the First Amendment. In these cases, rather than addressing the concerns raised by these decisions, state legislatures instead chose to narrow the scope of the laws in order to carve out the plaintiffs so that, the laws would no longer apply to those individuals, but kept the laws in place. And, as such, the underlying constitutional concerns and broader chilling effects remain unchanged. In June of last year, however, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Arkansas's anti-BDS law. And the court there ruled that a consumer boycott of Israel does not count as protected speech under the First Amendment, claiming that economic and commercial decisions are, quote, not inherently expressive conduct, unquote. Under the court's interpretation, so the Constitution would then allow, entities to advocate for a boycott, but not actually engage in boycotting. So this ruling breaks from Supreme Court precedent and history. In NAACP versus Claiborne, the seminal case in which the Supreme Court affirmed that boycotts that seek to bring about political change are protected by the First Amendment. And, so the Eighth Circuit really sort of guts that decision in its interpretation and analysis. The ACLU has appealed the Eighth Circuit's decision to the Supreme Court. That cert petition is pending. If it's taken up, we hope and will push for the Supreme Court to do the right thing here. But this court has shown in particular that they can't be trusted to protect fundamental rights. So I think it's good reason to not to wait and see what happens in the court, but really to continue to organize and push for repeal, for organizing to kind of to push back against these laws, at the state level as well. And I'll talk more about that hopefully near the end. But I want to turn to this other form of anti-BDS law, this other type of provision that we've seen. I think, the litigation challenging these laws has mostly been in the contract prohibition realm, but many of these laws have taken the form of an investment prohibition as well, which prohibits state agencies or pension funds from investing in entities that boycott in support of Palestinian rights. And until recently, we haven't seen too much enforcement against US companies or entities. And there's also been less litigation because it's been these types of prohibitions are harder to challenge as, for individuals. There's one case in Texas that was dismissed for lack of standing. But there's been a real uptick in the past few years to push for enforcement of these provisions. So, for example, following Airbnb's decision a few years ago to delist properties in Israeli settlements, which was taken after a years-long campaign by activists, Airbnb faced a campaign to get it to back down. And there were lawsuits, there was a public campaign, but also state anti-BDS laws came into play when state officials in Florida and Texas put the company on their blacklists, which prohibited state investments. At one point, the University of Texas Austin told faculty, students, and staff that they could not use school funds to stay in Airbnbs. It's unclear if that policy was required by the Texas law, but again, I think that points to the confusion over the scope of these laws and the potential for misapplication as well. Just a couple more examples in this realm, because I think they're important. I think Ben & Jerry's decision to stop selling ice cream in Israeli settlements unleashed a massive campaign against it and its parent company, Unilever. The Israeli government wrote to US state officials calling for them to punish Unilever under anti-BDS laws. New York, Texas, Florida, Arizona, and New Jersey at least all blacklisted Unilever and prohibited investment of state funds, including pension funds and Unilever. And in New Jersey alone, the state sold off about $182 million of state funds that had been invested in Unilever stocks and bonds. So, that's one example. I want to turn maybe to more recently, an ongoing example. The investment research firm Morningstar has faced just this concerted campaign attacking the practices of its subsidiary, Sustainalytics, which gives companies social and environmental responsibility ratings. Sustainalytics takes account of the human rights context in which companies operate in order to make its assessments, and as such had flagged companies that facilitate Israeli settlement construction or military operations in the occupied Palestinian territory. And JLens and a number of other Jewish organizations have led a campaign arguing that this constitutes bias. So even after Morningstar hired an outside law firm to investigate the allegations, the results of which found no evidence of bias, and after Morningstar agreed to the recommendations of the firm, the campaign has continued. And we have attorneys general of more than a dozen states calling on Morningstar to investigate these claims, threatening action under anti-BDS laws. There have been calls for investigation by the Commerce Department, arguing that the existence of these anti-BDS laws created a risk that Morningstar had a responsibility to tell investors about. So, in the face of this campaign, Morningstar, totally has caved I think in November of last year, announced that they would no longer be using the term occupied to describe the West Bank, Gaza, or East Jerusalem. They would stop using data from prominent sources, including UN bodies, and that a company's operations, presence in the occupied Palestinian territory would not automatically raise red flags, despite international legal consensus to the contrary around business and human rights guidelines. And still, the attacks continue, with JLens, which was recently absorbed by the ADL, sending a letter this week claiming that Morningstar had not done enough. There's a lot in this story, and I just would want to point you all to this really great, really thorough documentation by Mari Cohen and Jewish Currents this week, kind of laying out the Morningstar example. I think it's just really instructive in that, Morningstar's willingness and decision to cave on methodology and standards has not made the attacks stop. It's really only weakened the standards that they're relying on. And, I'll come back to this in a moment, opened the door to further attacks, I think, along the lines of what Shah described at the very start. So I want to come back to the implications of these anti-BDS laws in a moment. But I think anytime, the focus of this talk, this presentation, is on anti-BDS and anti-boycott laws. But I do think it's important to mention this other type of legislation that we are seeing, the IRA, or anti-Semitism redefinition bills, because we are seeing more and more of them. And this is an effort to codify a definition of anti-Semitism that conflates criticism of Israel and advocacy for Palestinian rights with anti-Semitism. So anti-Palestinian advocates are pushing this distorted definition, across the board, federal, state, local levels, with universities, social media companies, professional organizations. To date, it's been adopted by Arizona, Florida, Texas, Iowa, South Carolina, Tennessee, and New Mexico. And, I think we have to see this effort. It's part and parcel of the crackdown on BDS and the right to boycott. And perhaps, potentially more troubling, it's changing and amending anti-discrimination laws to encompass advocacy for Palestinian rights and BDS, both of which IRA proponents have argued, fall within the definition. So it's an effort to exceptionalize BDS and remove it from the broader boycott history and tradition. So there's a lot more that I could say, and that, we have resources, we have on IRA and these laws and why they need to be rejected. I can drop a link from our website to our resource page on this in a bit. So I think I think it's important to maybe, so coming back to just stepping back from the legislation to kind of, where is this coming from? And I think it's important to talk about, the role of the Israeli government in this effort, right? The Israeli government has identified boycotts and BDS in particular as an existential threat, and they've devoted over $100 million to fighting it. Israeli officials have bragged about shutting down bank accounts of human rights defenders, taking credit for anti-boycott legislation, and have pushed states to implement it against entities who have taken steps to call attention to Israel's human rights violations. I think it's also important to mention, pro-Israel groups here in the US are working very closely with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which brings together conservative legislators and corporate lobbyists to develop and disseminate model legislation that safeguards corporate power and white supremacy. They are responsible for pushing stand your ground laws and voter ID laws, among others. And Israel advocacy groups have worked closely with ALEC to develop model anti-BDS bills, as well as to advocate for IRA codification. I think ALEC's role in particular really signals, I think, the anti-progressive nature of anti-boycott and anti-Semitism redefinition bills. And I think the more recent history that Shah touched on and that I'll come back to, I think just only underscores that. So I think the only other, there's a lot of groups involved in these efforts, but I just want to flag the ADL needs to be mentioned here. They recently absorbed JLens, which had spearheaded the attacks on Morningstar and is doubling down on those attacks. I think the quote that Shah shared is instructive from the ADL CEO. ESG is the latest frontier in the fight against anti-Semitism. And I think that what is happening there is that, the ADL is sort of positioning itself as trying to preserve ESG, saying it is sort of supporting ESG, but at the same time, it's spearheading attacks that really undermine and politicize it. So similar to the problematic role the ADL has played for decades in hiding behind a liberal facade in order to protect Israel from criticism. So a lot to say in terms of where this is coming from, but really important, I think, to make the connection to right-wing organizations and efforts in the US, because I think it shows sort of what this is about and where it's coming from, and also hopefully points the way to how to fight back. I think here, really, I think Shah mentioned this, so I'll just touch on it again, but, since 2021, we've seen this proliferation of copycat bills, dozens of bills modeled after anti-BDS bills that target advocacy on a much broader range of issues, from climate justice to efforts to hold the firearms industry accountable to attacking mask and vaccine mandates. And ALEC has promoted these, even these anti-boycott bills that are modeled after anti-BDS bills. They've even developed this model bill that's targeted at boycotts more broadly, sort of fill in your, the movement, the targeted movement of choice, and that is the bill that's being circulated. So, that's one thing, is the proliferation of bills that are modeled after anti-BDS efforts targeting other movements. I think the other thing that we've seen in Morningstar here is really instructive is it really opened the door for a broader right-wing attack on ESG efforts, more broadly. We see the anti-ESG bills as well, modeled after anti-BDS bills, but really there's a whole narrative strategy that's really aimed at, undermining any kind of socially responsible investment strategy, any kind of corporate accountability efforts here. So the willingness to make a Palestine exception, I think, created a wedge that that right-wing actors are really prying open. So, I think there's a lesson here that Palestine cannot be separated from other social justice issues, and really the importance of addressing these issues together. So, and in that sense, right, the broader attack is an opportunity to organize alongside other movements who are also being targeted by this new wave of bills, both on the legislative front and potentially around litigation as well. Because, ultimately the repression, including legislative repression, it's not unique to Palestinian rights advocacy. It's part of a much broader context where we are seeing the government cracking down on protesters, human rights defenders, and those dissenting from the status quo. And so I think connecting those dots and making those connections and building together with other movements is critical as a way to face that together and to overcome it. Because even in the face of a variety of repressive measures, we are seeing, these movements grow and grow more powerful. And I think that underscores the importance of continuing to organize to try to repeal laws where they already exist, the efforts to push back against new bills, to continue to organize, including across different justice movements, and to continue organizing BDS campaigns. I think, we're also, so I'll just pause here because I want to give a shout out, because a shout out to the amazing folks in Virginia who defeated 2 of these bills this week, as well as to groups in Georgia, Nebraska, and several other states who are working so hard right now to keep new bills from passing. We have a list on our site where you can connect with coalitions in your state. We'll share the link, but please do let us know if you're part of a group that's not on our list and would like to be added. I think the last thing I'll say is that on the legislative front, I've talked a lot about repressive bills and legislation, but there's also, we've seen some affirmative efforts, right? Especially at the federal level. And I think that this is a sort of trend that also just needs more support. And it's ultimately what we'd like to see. It's accountability for Israeli violations and the realization of freedom, justice, and equality for Palestinians and Israelis, and the need to create space for more of these affirmative efforts by hopefully sort of setting aside and moving beyond some of these the repressive efforts that we've seen so much of. I've gone very fast, and I'm sorry if I spoke too quickly. I'm going to pause here and just flag that on our website, we are tracking these bills. We have a page where you can filter by type of legislation and to see where bills are pending, where they've been passed, what the status is. Like I said, it's a work in progress, so we know that there's many new bills that have just been introduced, and we're working to get them up there. But there's also a number of resources on the site as well, with methodology and statistics and additional information about specific topics. It also has links to legal letters opposing some of these bills that have been drafted by Legal or our allies that hopefully people can use as templates and make their own. But really, we Legal are happy to be a resource where we can, and we'll be trying to keep the site up to date. But if you are aware of new bills in your state, please do let us know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meera, for that. Thank you for being also part of such an amazing org that is just so committed to preserving the movement here, especially like in the US. So we have some questions. We have a few, and we'll also take some. I know there was a lot being dropped in the chat, so please continue to ask if you guys have some, but I'm going to ask Meera some first, and I might give my commentary before you respond. But how have these pieces of legislation impacted student organizers for justice in Palestine so far? So I'd actually like to give my take on this, kind of, because I did organize in my university the last 4 years, and they really do push back on Palestinian organizers, especially if you're in a leadership position or, depending on your university. But I can see this affecting students in many ways. My first concern would be divestment campaigns on campus. I wonder how successful students will be able to be if universities are deterred and like scared. Like also what Meera was mentioning a lot was like chilling people into self-censorship. So universities already are like kind of under the like spotlight. A lot of times like there's external backlash from the community, and I can see way less support than there already is for Palestinian organizers if there's not only like the social shift, but actual legislation being written against boycotting Israel or products that are made in illegal settlements. But I want to talk about the social shift a little bit more because I think that is probably the most impactful to students. I know in my time in SJP, a lot of my friends, even who like really care about the movement, would drop out because they were scared. I mean, there was like a wave where my entire SJP was doxxed, and like we're all on like blacklist websites, Zionist websites. So, I mean, that in itself is enough to like take a really big chunk out of the movement. And, you know, when you weaken an SJP, you weaken their ability to be successful with campaigns, or like you limit their ways to come up with ideas. And SJP is very, very, very powerful in upholding Palestinian liberation in America. So squashing that, I think it really concerns me for like the future of organizing for Palestine in America. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Meera.
No, I think that that's really important context, and I think that that's right in the sense that, you know, the laws themselves, I think, have very little direct impact on a lot of the student organizing that we're seeing on campus. And you know, I think really the laws are about entities that engage with the state. That is, you know, really the direct effect, and who's directly impacted. I think there's as I said, a broader chilling effect in terms of this idea that it is these laws embolden and sort of buttress the repression efforts, that the sort of really widespread repression efforts that Noor mentioned, that you know, I talked about in terms of the broader context of what we're seeing in terms of like the repression against Palestine advocacy here in the US, right? So when there's a smear campaign or a harassment campaign to target, you know, an SJP event, or you know, a campaign that's happening on campus, it is these laws are kind of pointed to as, you know, regardless of whether or not they apply, the sense that BDS is somehow condemnable, potentially illegal, and that it puts a thumb on the scales of, you know, leading to questioning and investigations and, you know, administrative hurdles that organizers have to go through in order to get to the substance and content of what they're trying to, the activism, right? And I think that is super chilling, and that is, you know, what we at Pal Legal have really been trying to push back against in terms of pushing back against university administrators who call folks in for questioning or investigations that, you know, to really push back against, you know, what is the basis for it? Is it advocacy for Palestinian rights? What are the policies that make this, you know, problematic in some way? And I think just really trying to create space, right, for the organizing and the activism to continue. And, you know, ways that, and that is, you know, what I think the legislation makes it really hard to do, is that it sort of puts this additional weight on the scales and emboldens the efforts to, you know, silence activists and advocates for Palestinian rights.
Thanks so much. So the next question is, what do you think these anti-BDS laws indicate about the state of the movement for Palestinian rights? I can speak a little about this, but I don't know if you want to go first, Meera. I don't want to like take off.
No, go for it. Go for it.
Okay, cool. So I think this says a lot about the state of the movement. One, I feel like we're losing the plot a little bit. I think this has to do a lot with capitalism. If we're really talking about the state of Palestine, we're talking about an oppressed people and their colonizer, and it really should be as simple as that. But when it comes to Palestine, a lot of people like really don't want to get their hands dirty. And like I said, the role of capitalism plays. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think that in this state of like the world where people are being held accountable, I guess more publicly whether or not whether or not companies or institutions are actually being held accountable. Obviously, like we can debate about that. But there is at least some sort of external backlash. And I feel like because of that, Israel has to turn to like these sly ways to perpetuate the occupation. And we need to be really aware of the way the occupation will adapt itself to every aspect of life so that it could preserve itself. And this is why I wanted to bring in capitalism. Obviously, if a company's objective is to maximize profit, they are going to want to squash everything that would get in the way of that, whether it's the real like ethical responsibility that they have, or whether it's just calming backlash from like external backlash. And I think this shows how much not only do we have to this is not just about like Palestine, but also other divestment campaigns like we were talking about. Like we need to be aware of the root of all the issues that create the occupation of Palestine. There's the issue of white supremacy and there's the issue of capitalism, and these things must sustain themselves in order to sustain the occupation. And I feel like that is coming to the surface a lot more, especially when we see companies like going to such lengths to not be called out and to not have their violations be brought to the surface. Meera, if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot there. I'm just trying to, so I guess what I would say is, if the question is, what do these laws indicate about the state of the movement? I would say that they point to the strength of the movement and how effective and successful it has been in really shifting the terms of the conversation, such that the response is not to engage on the terms of what is happening in Palestine, but rather to try to shut down the debate, which is what these bills and these laws are trying to do. So, I think that that to me is a sign of the movement really being very effective, and that the repression is taking the form of really not having the leg to stand on in the substantive debate, but rather trying to shut it down completely. So I think that obviously the laws themselves are very problematic, not only for the movement in terms of the chilling effect that we've talked about, but also in terms of the potential, the impacts we're actually seeing right now for other movements as well. But in terms of thinking big picture and sort of the trajectory here, I think it is a sign of the real important organizing that's been done for many decades to lay the groundwork so that these conversations are still pushing through. And I think really to underscore what I started with, just the importance of continuing to have those conversations to bring the focus back to Palestine is critical.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for reminding us of the optimism we should have. I know I tend to think more pessimistically, but it does say a lot about how strong Palestinians are in our movement for liberation. So thank you for touching on that. So I think you could probably answer this question better than I can, but it came from the chat and it says, it appears that the UK does more BDS protesting, including direct actions against weapons firms than the US. Can someone speak to this?
I'm not sure. I'm best placed. We're a legal organization, and we respond and support a range of different folks who come to us from various parts of the movement. Some who are involved in direct action, and others pursuing other tactics as well. So I think we do see a range of tactics being pursued here, but I don't know that I can speak to a comparison necessarily between the US and the UK. I don't know if you or Shay have more on that.
I personally I don't know if there's some sort of like data that supports that, like whether like if it does like happen more in the UK or if in the US it just like takes a different form. I personally I'm not sure. So yeah, I don't know if Shay, you have anything to add.
I don't have too much to add, but I did see some good notes in the chat, people talking about how maybe sentencing would be a little less harsh in the UK, how, you know, the American criminal legal system is really punitive towards protesters. And I know, you know, like I've been seeing a lot of actions from Palestine Action that have been really visibilizing this struggle. And maybe it's just a testament to their organizing strength and a combination of like less repercussions. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's a great question.
So our next question is, if Morningstar is pressured to make these human rights exceptions, is this not the case that companies will see little reason to even adhere to the bare minimum expectation of ethical corporate business practices? Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. Like if there's little accountability, I think any way a business, if they have the incentive to ignore ethical practices and they know that they can get away with it. I mean, like I said, I'm pessimistic. I tend to be more pessimistic, but I agree. I feel like they would see little reason.
Yeah, I mean, so I will speak to this from, you know, I'm coming at the ESG conversation from the Palestine context here in the US and the legislation that has been targeting Palestinian rights advocacy here. And so I'm not an expert on the SRI, socially responsible investing world by any means, but yeah, I think that there's no doubt that this you know, Morningstar's willingness to cave on this really calls into question their you know, how can they approach and claim consistency about their methodology and claim that they are following particular standards in providing ratings to companies when they're willing to cave to this kind of political pressure? You know, I think it calls into question all kinds of different things in terms of you know, what authority do they have then, and why should investors listen to them? You know, so I think it's a really dangerous precedent that they have set there. But I think also just to, you know, like agree with Noor, right? That like the ESG framework is challenging in and of itself if you're coming from you know, an anti-capitalist stance, in the sense that it's premised on this idea of corporations like doing the right thing, and it's often framed in terms of it being less risky and potentially better for profits if they follow these guidelines, right? And so, you know, I'm just calling out some tension there, you know, in terms of how some of the ESG stuff I've seen framed. But again, I'm not an expert in that, and I'm curious actually if Shay has thoughts on that as well.
Oh my gosh, it's a really excellent question. Honestly, Meera, would you mind repeating like the last part of what you just said, just so I can respond well?
Sorry, I know you're wearing lots of different hats, so it's unfair to call on you. But no, I was just asked, like, I think that this idea that ESG, if you're coming from an anti-capitalist perspective, right, and this idea, then the idea of ESG really being framed in terms of making investments less risky, and, you know, really still being about profit, right, as the driver for why a company might look at ESG, because, you know, to not do so might impact their bottom line because of the inherent risk involved. And so, you know, I think just situating that framework alongside maybe a more left or anti-capitalist one is just interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I really appreciate how both of you like frame the tension there. I think with a lot of the divestment campaigns that I'm involved with, that's something that we talk about really specifically, because a lot of us who are involved in our anti-militarist organizing are coming at it from an anti-capitalist perspective as well. And there's also the fact that divestment organizing can be really effective, and different organizing can take place and work in tandem with each other, even when they're working on different levels, like, you know, grounding in the fact that the white supremacist capitalist structure that we live within perpetuates Zionism and settler colonialism and these structures that we're working to dismantle, and some organizing to divest certain companies, pension funds can make material impacts in the meantime, can stigmatize companies or countries that are doing a lot of harm and get us to a good place where we can then move further. But yeah, it's never going to be the full thing, you know, like targeting the stock market or implementing ESG principles in large corporations aren't going to take us all the way to revolution. But I think it's an important question, and I appreciate how both of you are speaking to it.
Okay, so Meera, you did talk about a few states where this anti-BDS legislation was shot down, and someone was wondering what tactics to fight against anti-BDS legislation have been effective. Like, what have you seen through legal means, like in courts and otherwise, that were effective in shooting down this legislation?
So there's maybe two different questions, and I'll take the sort of legislative advocacy piece first, and just in terms of fighting back against pending bills and places where we've seen successful campaigns. And I think that the Virginia example is a really good one. And they, you know, in terms of just super mobilized a very much of a number of different movements and organizations and activists, you know, involved, and a real engagement at the state level, you know. And I think ultimately the context is the local, like the context differs, right? And understanding both having the information to know, you know, what are the powerful committees here, who are the individuals who make these decisions, who has relationships to those individuals, like that's critical. And that's information that we Legal, you know, don't have. And so when we, you know, we're able to offer resources or analysis or support, but it's really the people on the ground who are able to make things happen and have those conversations and move lawmakers to understand, you know, how this is impacting them. But I think that the local context is huge. I think having a really, you know, broad coalition where people are turning out and mobilizing has been very effective. I think, you know, in terms of like the arguments, obviously, you know, the First Amendment arguments are really strong and really do appeal to, you know, a broader swath of lawmakers, I think, but also telling the stories of Palestinians, right, who are experiencing this, and how you know, in terms of like IRA legislation, for example, how the definition really prevents Palestinians from telling their stories and sort of creates punishments for people talking about their experiences and history. So like telling those stories of impact, I think is really critical. And similarly for, I think, anti-BDS bills, the importance of like why we boycott, what is this about, and bringing it back to that explanation, I think also super powerful. So you know, I would defer ultimately to the actual folks on the ground in these state coalitions who are doing the work on this about, you know, what has worked in specific campaigns. And I think that there's a lot of lessons to offer there. And you know, I think I saw a question come by at some point, like, you know, part of what we would love to do if we can is to connect folks working on different campaigns. If you're not already in touch, you know, I think there's just a lot of rich history and knowledge and lessons learned there to be exchanged.
Thanks so much. And we have another question. I think this is going to be the last one for the sake of time. It's related to what you were saying. It says, I'm in Tennessee, which of course is very pro-Israel in the first place. Plus, we don't have any active campaigns supporting Palestine in my area. What actions should I suggest to people who want to support Palestine or support BDS efforts? So really quickly, I just want to say, if you want to support Palestine, simply like you can support BDS yourself. You can, we'll have the website, I can send it in the chat. They have a bunch of targeted boycotts. If you yourself can boycott those companies, you can tell your friends to boycott those companies. Also, I'd suggest telling people to even like simply talk to their family about what's going on in Palestine, open up that conversation. And like Meera was saying, share those stories of Palestinians and their struggle for liberation. It's really, for me, I think that simple. I like to say that organizing like starts at home. Some of the hardest organizing you'll probably do is like within your own house. And if you guys feel strong enough, and if you know some like organizers in your area, possibly, know that like you can empower yourself and those around you to have a campaign of your own, and to you like be that active campaign for Palestine. If it's you and a group of people that have like you feel like you have the capacity to, and you can connect like with CODEPINK, connect with different, there's like many different resources you can connect to, and you can be that Palestine campaign that you wish like was in your community. But yeah, if you want to get into organizing for Palestine, it's really as simple as like starting at home or boycotting things yourself.
I think that's a great answer, Note. And the two things I would add to that, just one, I would, suggest reaching out to, organizations that have a national presence to see if there is anyone in Tennessee, and if there are any active either efforts, campaigns, locally, state level, Jewish Voice for Peace, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Those are good starting points to just connect and see what's available, what's out there. And then, I think just to go back to something that I was saying before in terms of, this opportunity and the absolute critical importance of really connecting with other movements here. So maybe there's not a strong active Palestine campaign, but there's, racial justice campaign, there's a climate justice campaign, there's all kinds of ways that our movements are under attack, and there's opportunities to build those bridges and to make the connections between our struggles, and to bring Palestine into that space, and ideally to bring others back to fight for Palestinian rights as well.
Thank you. I think I see somebody asking, does anyone know where to get boycott Israeli food stickers? Is that what you just sent, Shay? I'm not sure exactly like where to find that, but maybe I could find something. But okay, so really quick, just to wrap up, I don't want us to go too much over time, but Shay did link the BDS website in the chat, and I want to just tell you guys a few of the targeted boycotts that BDS like focuses on. There's like a ton of like companies to boycott, of course, but they work best when we do a targeted boycott. So HP, Puma, Sabra, Pillsbury, I know that one like might be hard to let go of. SodaStream, nobody uses that, so it's all good. And then Ahava Cosmetics, I'm actually wearing a shirt to boycott Ahava Cosmetics. They operate in the Dead Sea. They're an Israeli company, so they really simply steal Palestinian resources and then sell them for their own profit. And then, of course, follow Palestine Legal's work. I'm sure there's a link in the chat for that, or join a state coalition. And then also we have this action to ask Antony Blinken to pressure Israel into releasing Palestinian prisoner Ahmed Sadat. So there's that too. And I think we're all good. Is there anything in the chat, Shay, that I might be missing?
I don't think so, but I think people were saying that Pillsbury actually left Israel, so they're off the list.
Oh, okay. I was on their website yesterday, so let me double check that. That would actually be good news for me, I'm not gonna lie, because I did used to like Pillsbury.
Shout out to the service committee for that. I'm seeing Terry in the chat saying AFSC led that campaign. That's great.
Okay. Yeah, so it does look like they're off the list. I'm sorry to put that on there. But these other companies very much so are still on the BDS list. But I think that wraps us up. Thank you everybody for joining. It always makes me happy to see like all these people want to learn about Palestinian liberation and what's going on in the movement now. So thank you guys so much. Make sure you guys are like subscribed to CODEPINK email thread so that you guys can be the first to know when we're going to have events like this, to keep up with alerts, and always follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. And yeah, make sure you keep up with us and stay in the movement. Thank you guys so much. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Meera. Thanks everyone for joining. Make sure to save the chat. There's good stuff in there.